Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name's Brian Cowie, and with me I have Anash, and we brought you all here together today to talk about the controversial topic of SharePoint to Dataverse for the Power Platform. Now, there's a lot of opinions on both sides of this conversation, and we hope to discuss the use cases and technical reasons why you would choose one over the other for your business solutions. That said, before we jump into the battle royale that is SharePoint versus Dataverse, I want to spend some time covering some housekeeping items in terms of how this webinar is going to work. First and foremost, this webinar is being made available to multiple Microsoft customers. So what does that mean for you? Well, your name, email, and even your avatar could be visible to others on this webinar. If you're uncomfortable with that, please feel free to drop now. After the webinar, you can contact myself, Anash, or even your business application sales specialist to get more information on this topic on an individual or one-to-one basis. Second, I want to talk about getting your questions answered. Being most of us have our own perspective on SharePoint versus Dataverse conversations, you may want to chime in for clarification or to add your own perspective. You may be looking at the webinar and noticing, well, I don't have access to turn on my mic or my video. How am I going to ask a question? Let me draw your attention up to the top navigation bar inside of the Teams webinar, and you'll notice there's a button for Q&A. Feel free, and we encourage you throughout the course of this webinar to drive those questions into that Q&A at the top. We have a team here live who's actually monitoring that Q&A chat and answering questions and publishing those responses out to the rest of the group if we feel it's relevant for everyone. We definitely want to encourage participation through the Q&A feature. Lastly, I want to share that this webinar is going to be recorded. So if you do need to drop early or you want to take this and share with your colleagues throughout the organization, you'll be receiving an email with a link to the recording of today's webinar. And I just want to let you know, the webinar recording will only be made available for 30 days following the end of the webinar. So feel free to take the recording within the 30 days to review some of the content that we're talking about, share it with some colleagues. Happy to have you share that information and have you even have your own debate on the topic. Just do it inside the 30-day period. Now that's it for housekeeping items. So with all that said, let's jump into today's topic of SharePoint to Dataverse, elevating your data platform. So this is really the agenda we're going to be covering today. From observations to pros and cons, what a transition journey would be going from SharePoint to Dataverse, and what enablement materials are out there. I'm really going to be covering the first half of this webinar, so let's get started really with the observations that we have going on here. Now, I'd like to start with SharePoint. SharePoint Online, what is it? I think most of us know, but in its current instantiation, SharePoint Online, we're really driving as the intelligent intranet for Microsoft 365. It's truly there to share knowledge and discovery, to be there for communication of employee experiences, and to share content and business solutions. Well, it sounds like, Power Apps definitely fits inside there with the Power Platform. Now, if we take a look at the Wayback Machine, SharePoint wasn't always just in this space. If we really look, and this is an image that we've gotten from some of our modern work team, if we look at this holistic history of SharePoint, going all the way back to Site Server in 98 and Content Management Server, I want to say that a lot of us inside of the, that have been exposed to the SharePoint space have probably seen the evolution of what should be used or what SharePoint should be used for. And really, starting to reach part of its peak of integration inside of SharePoint 2007 and 2010, before the transition over into the SharePoint Online context, you saw things like the wheel. And this is an example of the one on the left being the SharePoint wheel for 2007, going from collaboration and embedded search and business processes and business intelligence, and it's this platform services. And transitioning to 2010 with sites and communities and content, we still had search in there and composites, where today when we really look at SharePoint, it is creating content collaboration throughout the Microsoft cloud. So if it's collaboration on Office and apps, if it's shared content throughout Teams and Outlook, accessing this content anywhere for your files inside of OneDrive. Of course, employee engagement with Yammer and Stream, now even Viva Engage. You have the digital experiences with portals and spaces all embedded with core security and AI and extensibility. SharePoint isn't the natural space now for core business solutions that are deriving from business problems itself. So we look at where do we take that pivot and where do we go? Now for me, I'm a business application sales specialist. The first place I go ahead and look is Dataverse. And many people like to talk about Dataverse as just another data store. And it couldn't be more wrong. Dataverse, how I always call it, is this true low-code backend that you can use for all of your business solutions. It is that backend that drives all of our customer engagement applications for Dynamics 365. And it's because you have the ability to define a core data model for your business objects and bring your own custom stuff. That's all well and good, but make it traditionally application lifecycle management or ALM aware. You can leverage these strong data types and true relationships to be able to work with that data in or outside of the Power Platform. Of course, embedded inside of the strong enterprise governance and security, because we bring natural row, column, hierarchical-based security and configuration that you don't have in other platforms. But what it does is it allows you to leverage that rich metadata, the business rules, the workflows, the data integration, and a whole lot more. So you may be asking, well, what's in this thing, right? Like what's inside of Dataverse? And if you look at the core, yes, it's a data platform that has a bunch of these various components. And being able to access Dataverse is the same, regardless if you're doing it from our first-party applications, like Power Apps, Power Automate, Pages, or if you're accessing it from a third-party data source, be that a Xamarin app or even Visual Studio. Now, as we start looking at the layers here from a core security perspective. Of course, with Dataverse being built on top of Azure, we're leveraging all of the traditional authentication means that Azure Active Directory has. And we're being able to also leverage auditing capabilities, both native inside of Dataverse and throughout the Microsoft stack. But then we're bringing additional authorization components with our unique security role concepts inside of Dataverse. Now, all of this, once again, driven all the way down to the API layer. So regardless if you're hitting it from Power Apps or Xamarin, it's honored all the way down. When we move out to the next layer between the logic, of course you have things like business rules and workflows, and we have our calculated and our roll-up fields, we have our third-party plugins, and we even have natural duplicate detection. You go another layer out, now we actually start to talk about data. But really, it's actually more about the definition, once again, of those business objects and what the common data model truly is. Some natural data validation and actually providing native, mobile, and offline support. Of course, you can do additional reporting and, the catalog and discovery services on top of that. Now we finally get to what most people think of when they think about a data storage mechanism, and that is things like, yes, relational databases, check. But we also have the ability to bring all of this together with files and blobs, and you don't have to worry about the shape or structure of them and how they're stored from a performance perspective. We also can store semi-structured data, our audit logs. We, of course, have native built-in relevant search to find data, and all also built on top of a data lake platform for scale. Now, what this also then allows is natural integrations through ALM, as I already referenced at least before, but then going into eventing vis-a-vis service buses, event hubs, webhooks, data exporting, maybe out to an existing lake or even Azure Synapse Analytics, right? All of these layers is what's truly behind Dataverse, so it is significantly more than just another data storage mechanism. And when you think about unpacking the kind of security layer, well, we have security in a lot of different places, SharePoint included, right? But let's talk about the layers of security that we have the ability to use inside of Dataverse. Now, this kind of goes from the top down a little bit, but you have your environmental containers. I would say that kind of correlates to our site collections, if you will, inside of SharePoint. There are containers for our Dataverse schema, our apps, our flows, our bots, like all of this kind of stuff. We then have the next layer down that talks about business units. What if you had separate areas of your organization working on the same data store, but need to segregate that data across different business units, native inside of the Dataverse platform? When you talk about ownership, this is probably one of the biggest differentiators that we have between Dataverse and SharePoint necessarily. Ownership drives security inside of Dataverse. What that really means is we have natural row-level security, making sure that people can only access or take action on the data based off of their role and based off of the ownership of that current record. Now, when we talk about how and what they can do, that's security roles, right? So you can see the system customizer role, and you have a bunch of different layers and levels for where security roles come into place. Yes, we have permission levels, right? Inside of SharePoint, things like full control and contribute and read. And you have the ability to create your own permission levels, but then you have to apply those in very distinct areas. If they're at the site level, at the list or library level, at the folder level, at the item level, and they're all kind of the same. What we have inside of Dataverse from a security role is saying, these are all of the tables that I need to have some level of access to. And that can be based off of just the things that I own. It could be based off of the things that my business unit owns. Maybe even my child business units or the entire organization, right? And I have the ability to set those permissions, not just for one thing at those layers, but for all the CRUD, right? Create, read, write, delete, append to, assign, and even share. We can have these unique security requirements that are built on our security roles that can then be assigned to a team of people or an individual even to grant them access to only the specific content that they should be able to view. Now, I mentioned Teams, and Teams is used a lot inside of the Microsoft landscape. Think of Teams as groups, right? We're being able to leverage a group of individuals or a collection of individuals. And that can either be just a native team inside of Dataverse. We can actually leverage that based off of an Office 365 or an Azure Active Directory group. Those can all be referenced as teams or just groups of users that we can then give those permissions. The levels are kind of what I already talked about a little bit between the level of permissions on an individual action. So if we think about create, right, we have the ability to do it at the user level, the organization level, and then in between the business or the child business unit level themselves. And then uniquely, we actually even have things like column security levels, where we can actually provide API level accessibility to data, not just to read, but to update or even create data. So if you think about highly secured content, be that PII data, be that health data, be that whatever it is that's sensitive, that you want to make sure that only certain individuals at certain levels have access to, you can enable column level security on any column throughout Dataverse, leveraging our security roles and our column security profiles. And then lastly, from a security perspective, we offer native hierarchy-based security. You may be asking, what does that mean? Well, what that means is we have two ways of hierarchy-based security. One is true manager hierarchy, right? Like, as a manager, let me make sure that I have access to my direct employees, data, and even my employees' data. And what happens there from a read level versus CRUD level all kind of depends also on the security roles that you have. Not only do we have manager hierarchy, but we also have something called position hierarchy. So if you think about a manager, right? In a manager hierarchy sort of position, the first way I talked about, let's say that we had a customer service manager versus a sales manager. Of course, you'd only want the customer service manager initially to have access to maybe their CSR agent data. You wouldn't want the customer service manager necessarily accessing the salespeople's, right, data just because they're a manager. However, there are some scenarios where just being at a position of a manager, an executive, a board member, right, that you want to actually drive permissions to flow downstream to say, regardless of wherever I'm coming from, if I am an executive, I have access to the manager's levels underneath and then their users underneath. And it flows upwards too. So think about that from a hierarchy position, which we actually have natively that you can leverage inside of Dataverse. All right, so that's the startings of the observations. If we next now go to things like our pros and cons, okay? And we have about 8 different scenarios that I want to talk about. First one, if we think about pros and cons of use cases from SharePoint to Dataverse. When you really think about SharePoint use cases, they should be for general, either team collaboration, right? Stuff that isn't necessarily going to have to scale hugely, or even personal use cases, if you will. Generally speaking, SharePoint, unless you're doing it from just a core intranet standpoint, you're not necessarily going to be creating things for organizational wide use, especially when it comes to business processes. Now, when you start thinking about things that span an entire organization, and I commonly think about things inside of IT or HR. So right, if I think about IT ticketing systems or HR onboarding or benefits enrollment, right? Think about the level of scale that's required and the permission structures that are required there. That's something to think about as you kind of move forward. Next is we talk about the volume of information. Now, this gets into a lot of the kind of delegation rules that we have inside of the Power Platform and specifically calling out the SharePoint APIs. But volume really comes to bear when you have to start filtering or slicing on data that's going over this 500 to 2,000, right, sort of item threshold. And delegation, end of the day, basically is around things like, let me provide a filter server side so that I'm processing that filter to the entire data set versus doing it on just the first 2,000 records that are coming back. Now, because of the way that the API structures are formulated from a SharePoint perspective, we run into various problems in volume. Now, as a SharePoint person myself back in the day, I can argue with you day in and day out that SharePoint has the ability to store and work on data in huge volumes, right? Millions of records inside of a list or library. The one thing that I will say about that, those huge, large data volume sets are around non-collaborative workloads. That's going to be around letting me have a records repository or a place that we're not having active workflows, changing states, adjusting permissions, modifying the contents of some of these indexed areas in order to process. They are end state things that aren't necessarily changing for these large, large data volumes. Dataverse is built in a way that provides enormous scale up. So keep that at least in mind. Next, we have the data modeling. Now, traditionally speaking then from a SharePoint perspective, we have our SharePoint lists, right? And there are some templates that are there from things like events and technically contacts lists. We of course have the custom list aspect itself. Dataverse comes with a common data model. Now, that's been birthed out of our Open Data Initiative with SAP and Adobe, but really the common data model provides you a jump point for a lot of the standard objects that most organizations have to work with. Now, some of these align with a lot of our core sales functionality inside of Dynamics, but it's things like everybody has an account or contacts or emails. Like, it's the core definition of what those things are and how they relate to each other. We don't necessarily have those same data models. We have content types, right, inside of SharePoint that we can create, and there's a bunch of those differently. But these data models themselves have the ability not to have just their own definition, but they're also relational to other objects and other tables inside of Dataverse as well. Things to keep in mind. Then it comes to business rules. Now, business rules inside of SharePoint are traditionally going to be our core workflow components that aren't necessarily built directly on top of our schema. Now, in the past, right, we've had the ability to deploy SharePoint designer workflows on top of specific content types and go, but those are mostly all asynchronous. What about being able to have the kind of cascading drop-downs that you may want to have to say, if I have selected the Department of HR, let me only show the business solutions that are available for HR. Or even more so, if I chose this particular account, let me only see the opportunities directly related to that account. Or based off of the contract size or contract agreement that we have with a particular location, let me only allow you to choose from certain values or even show or hide certain fields. Even being able to set different values. We can configure all of these business rules directly on top of our data model inside of Dataverse. Now, I already talked about data access, right? At least a little bit before inside the security area, but let's double click on that here a little bit again. When you're providing people access to content inside of SharePoint, it's going to traditionally be through SharePoint group membership. And they're going to be granted the traditional permission levels, be that full control, contribute, read. And yes, you have the ability to break inheritance at any given level, be that the list level, the folder level, the item level that you have inside there. But then we talk about scale when it comes to unique scopes that are available. Now, one of the main reasons why SharePoint Online has even gone into the flat level site collection structure that it is are the unique security scopes that are really supported inside of SharePoint, which is really set at 5,000. You start to have performance issues just even calling or accessing data in a site collection that can have more than 5,000 different unique scopes. And really what that means is unique security at all of these differing layers. And we know that breaking inheritance on different areas inside of SharePoint has very unique context, especially if you try to re-inherit in different areas or it has that limited access level permission that can be hidden or shown in all those various cases, right? From a Dataverse perspective, all the data access is driven through the record ownership, through our security roles, and through the teams and users that we apply those security roles to. All of this is meant to scale for all of your actual business data, and it's being able to be done at the environment level. Now let's go ahead and talk about data ingestion. Like, how does data get into our system? From a SharePoint perspective, it's mostly manual entry, or I've seen tons of customers leveraging PowerShell scripts and obviously info path forms before and all that kind of good stuff. If we are looking at driving data into Dataverse, we have many different modalities. Yes, we have Power Apps from a manual perspective, both Canvas and Model App. We also have other tools like our data flow framework that's kind of been birthed out of Power BI. Use that. We have things like Azure Data Factory. And heck, we even have third-party utilities such as a TIBCO Scribe, a Kingsway Soft. All of that can be used from a data ingestion and really ETL format from a Dataverse perspective. Then let's start to drive down into intelligence. Now, SharePoint has SharePoint Syntax now, which, funny enough, actually leverages AI Builder birthed out of the Power Platform. Now, all of this direct intelligence, and Copilot is the phrase of the day anymore, at least inside of Microsoft, but driving direct embedded intelligence throughout your core actual data platform is unique. Now, really, both SharePoint and Dataverse are leveraging some of our other constructs. So be that AI builder that can leverage prediction modeling, it can leverage churn, it can leverage entity extraction or category classification natively inside of the platform and leverage Dataverse as that training data model. Now, Syntax at the end of the day is actually leveraging all the same things, at least under the hood. So at least keep all of that in mind. Now, the last thing, and I've probably harped on it already, right, from a roles and permissions aspect, since we have our containers for things like environments, right, and business units, all of that drives down, but our core security role structure and the permissions that we can apply is uniquely different in Dataverse than it is in SharePoint, where we have those permission levels in SharePoint groups that don't span across multiple site collections. And then we even have things that can cross, right, a lot of these varying tables from a security role sort of perspective. So when we get to the SharePoint v Dataverse, some of this may be a little bit of reiteration, but let's go ahead and talk to it again, right? Like, not every app should be on Dataverse necessarily. There are unique requirements for everything. But when we talk about using SharePoint or using Dataverse, if there's this collaborative need for data, especially through things like co-authoring, especially documents, Dataverse doesn't do that well. We can store documentation inside of Dataverse, but as far as collaborating on those documents, like, SharePoint really shines there. So leverage SharePoint for that sort of perspective. Now, if there's other things that need to actually have rapid churn for data that needs to be created or updated extremely frequently, like, go ahead and take a look at Dataverse, depending on volume, see where that needs to go. And then we talk about volume. So if it's a relatively small sort of data set, meaning less than 2,000 items, having those CRUD activities, like, SharePoint can still be a really good place for that. But as soon as you start to go around that 2,000 plus threshold, and you need to apply native filtering or searching at least on top of that, you're potentially going to be running into issues from a SharePoint perspective. So take a peek from a Dataverse or even other like SQL Server or anything like that, right? When we talk about unique security requirements, be that item level permission, column level security, hierarchy security, that all leans into the area of Dataverse. Versus SharePoint, where, I mean, if everybody can basically access the same things, if you will, right? No item level security, and as long as that's the norm, right, and not the exception, SharePoint can very much be in there. Now, when it comes to data access, right, if the data is not just going to be accessed inside of like a Power App, but you want people to leverage the SharePoint native UI, obviously, leveraging SharePoint data and just enhancing that experience is a great place to go. But when you start to talk about where people even need to access this data, and even what modes. So if you think about accessing it, of course, via mobile. But what about like a Zebra scanner? What about a different sort of kiosk device or different access points? What if I need to access not in my normal sort of work mode? Think about that from a Dataverse perspective. What if I want to create a custom app and I need a great data store that has all these things in, and I may even still use pro dev methodologies on top of Xamarin or Visual Studio? Okay, like, let's take a look at that from a Dataverse perspective. When we talk about relational data, now SharePoint has lookups. They don't have relational data, right? It's not enforceable. Where inside of Dataverse, we have true enforceable cascading actions around one-to-many, many-to-one, many-to-many. And if any relational data is truly required, please take a look at inside of Dataverse. And then you have things around analytics. Now, of course, we can have various analytic areas to tap into from like a Power BI perspective, at least on both places. But what if you need to drive larger sets of data volume out to something like a data lake for more analytics? Once again, something to take a peek at from a Dataverse perspective. Now, as I kind of finish up here on my section, some of the qualifying questions to really start to ask yourselves are, from a data perspective, what tape, what type, what size, what shape? will my solution or my application require? What about search? Like, how do we actually want to search on top of that data? And does what's natively inside the Graph API, have that accessibility for me? Once again, how is my solution going to be made available? Do I want it embedded inside of something like Teams? Do I want it embedded inside of a different app? Are my people going to access these from a traditional desktop, laptop? What about mobile? What about guests? Right? Guests are a lot easier to be able to access some things from a SharePoint perspective, just from a licensing perspective. But what about from a Power App standpoint or Power Pages? Once again, who's going to build, and not only build, but maintain? And what are the skill sets that these people basically have? And really, what kind of special capabilities around things like AI does your solution need? When it comes into integration, where does your data actually naturally sit so that you're not necessarily swivel chairing or duplicating your data between these various systems, right? Or do you need to tap into other databases, other services, stuff like that? And then lastly, from a governance standpoint, right? What are your requirements around things like security and compliance, especially things around data loss prevention and storing secure data, and who has the ability to access this stuff? And what about backup and restoring? What kind of requirements do we have? Do we have actual requirements for things like a dev stage prod? Different things like that. So with that, I want to go ahead and pass over to Anash to be able to go through the rest of the webinar. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. Now we're going to focus more on the journey, right? What does it look like moving a SharePoint app to Dataverse? And also, what are different stages and different ways we can do that, right? Based on the kind of apps that you have. So the answer really depends on, what kind of apps you are creating, whether you already have existing apps, you want to modernize those apps, or whether you are thinking of new use cases and trying to decide, which source to use, right? So the journey is very different for all these different kind of scenarios. What I'll show you now is a quick demo of an app that uses SharePoint as a data source and as well as Dataverse as a data source. And we'll just quickly compare and contrast delegation within that apps. And it's really important because, a lot of times we see customers that reach out to us, reach out to us saying that, they have inaccurate data in Power Apps when they have SharePoint as a data source. And it's really important to understand, what are the different reasons it can happen, right? So let me share you my demo environment, and we'll see that exactly how it works, okay? So this is a Canvas app. In this example, I have used two different data sources. One is SharePoint, and then the other one is Dataverse. So basically, I'm trying to replicate one of the challenges that our customers come us too often with. And the first screen you see here is the app rendering SharePoint as a data source. So when we use SharePoint as a data source, my bad. So now you're seeing the SharePoint as a data source. So when we use SharePoint as a data source, we can see that we have around 2,000 records here, right? And then the sum is 124400000. But now let's take a look at what happens when we render the same data, same level of data with Dataverse as a data source. So when I click to Dataverse, now is rendering using Dataverse as a data source, and the count is 10,000, right? And the sum is also different. So what's happening here is, the data sources that we're using is really important because what Canvas app does is, it delegates the data sources to process the data, right? So in the first example, when we use SharePoint as a data source, the Power Apps delegated SharePoint to process the data. And SharePoint, as Brian told you earlier, right, it's more of it's not like a complete database environment which can do highly complex or CRUD operations, right, and so on. So SharePoint wasn't able to process the data properly, and as a result, we only got 2,000 records back to our Canvas app, right? But when you choose Dataverse, you can see the count is 10,000 because Dataverse is really good at handling large volume data, and we're able to get accurate result here. Furthermore, you'll notice that SharePoint has limitations with the kind of operations and functions you can do within manipulating the data, right? So if you want to add filter and sorting, you can start to see, there is a lot of performance degradation when you're using SharePoint. Sometimes the screen doesn't load and so on. You'll see those kind of things. So there is a documentation that describes more about delegation and what are the different functions and operations that works well with which kind of data sources. If you're interested, I can share that. But it's always important to look at those things, right, when you're trying to decide what data source to use for your app. Okay, I just want to quickly show that. To summarize again, depending on the data sources and the use case for your app, right, the idea is to understand the volume that you need for your app, right, and the security implications and so on, and decide what is right source for your Canvas apps. Okay, so now let's go back into a transition journey and see what are different transition journeys and how does it look like, right? So over here I have several different transition journey based on scenarios. So the first scenario I have is you already have an existing SharePoint list app, right? You have a list within SharePoint, and you want to move that into Dataverse and start creating apps, right? So we'll see how exactly to do that. And now, so let's take a look at example where we already have existing SharePoint list app, and we want to migrate this into Dataverse, right? So I have already this employee list within SharePoint. Now we want to migrate this information into Dataverse. Let's do that, okay? So to do that, I'll go to my Power Apps environment. And within Power Apps, there are several different ways to integrate external data source. For this demo, I'm going to use data flows. So data flows is something, if you have used Power BI, you may be familiar with Power Queries. So data flows is bringing that capability within Power Apps. Okay, it's allowing us to integrate with external sources and bring data into Dataverse. So let's create a new flow. And I don't want to do the whole process because it takes some time. But typically, what you will do is you'll create a new data flow. You'll call this like SharePoint migration employee list, right? And you create it. So there are several different sources you can bring the data into Dataverse from. Depending on the kind of apps you have, right? So if you have already developed an app on SQL Server, you can just point to SQL Server and it will start bringing data into data source, right? Similarly, if you have already an app built on other web APIs, you can also choose that. Okay, so depending on your use case, you can choose the right platform. For our demo, we want to choose SharePoint Online List, right? So let's grab this site URL from here, from the SharePoint list, and you'll create a secure connection just like this, right? You have advanced option if you want to choose the authentication method and so on, but just like this, you'll be able to start creating connection and start to get the data from SharePoint into data flows. Into Dataverse. So over here, you can choose the list, and it gives you a preview of what the list is going to look like, and you want to make sure and transform data. So this screen allows you to really massage the data, right? Make some changes, add some queries, add some filters, and so on, so that you can match the format that you need within your desired location, right? For your Dataverse app. So typically, right, as you can see here, we want to improve this, right? Because title is a little confusing, so we can call it first name first. I believe this is last for now, and field 3, you can edit this to make it easier for you to map later. So we can call this one, let's call seller. Okay, so you can do some other advanced properties as well, as you can see here. So we'll click next. Now, this is where you start to do the mapping. So typically, I suggest you to create a table before that, right? So that you already have a structure and blueprint on how you want the mapping to be done. So over here, you can have this create a new table for you based on the information that was available in the list, or you can load to existing table by finding the table. So I won't do this process, but after you choose so yeah, over here you just choose the table that you want to map to, right? In our case, employee info, and you get all these different fields that you can map to, right? So we want to map that with our first name, I believe. So first we want we want to map that with email, and last name with last, and this one we want to map with first, and salary info we want to map with salary info. So after this, once you click next, you'll be able to do mapping. I already did, so I'll just skip this part for now, and I'll show you the existing mapping that I did earlier, right? So if I click edit here, you can see, I have done this previously, and I have already stored this in Dataverse, right? So I want to show you that. So once you do that mapping, it has options for you to do refresh. And you can choose the frequency you want the refresh to be done, right? So if you want the Dataverse to look at your existing SharePoint app every 1 hour, once a day, or every 5 minutes, you have that frequency that you can choose for the data sync, okay? So I've already done this. Now I'll show you, I'll show you app using this SharePoint list as a data source that we were able to do after migrating the information from SharePoint list. So to that, I'll go to apps, and I believe it's this app. Is this? So yeah, so earlier I did this to save some time, but with the help of data flows, we're able to bring this entire SharePoint list into Dataverse. And now you can see that representation here in Dataverse, right? So this is Power Platform, which is using Dataverse as a source because we're able to integrate that information from SharePoint list into Dataverse. Within a matter of few minutes, we're able to, migrate the data from SharePoint list into Dataverse. Not only migrate the data, but we're also able to get the right fields and right data that we need, right? Now, hey, we can always modify the name here, but that's the idea. So one of the things, right, that Brian talked a little bit about was now, within Dataverse, you have so much options for adding security as well. So what that means is, within Dataverse, you have the options to add security roles, right? So which gives you a lot more control over how you want the data to be rendered. And, if you want the employee infos to look different for different kind of user base or team, you have that ability because Dataverse is very rich in adding role-based security controls and so on, right? And similarly, we can create several different kind of lookup relationship and or other advanced relationship with Dataverse, right? So I have this employee table, but now if I want to create a relationship, let's say n is to 1 or 1 is to n with let's say employees. We want to create an employee and some other table, maybe paycheck, right? So we want to track, right, for Laura all the paychecks she has received. So 1 is to n kind of scenario, you are able to do that, right? So depending on which kind of what kind of app you want, how advanced you want the relationships to be, right, and so on, it really guides you to choose the right platform to use. But definitely wanted to demonstrate, once you migrate that information from SharePoint list into Dataverse, you have so much flexibility, right, in terms of making the apps more advanced, right, in terms of adding relationship, in terms of doing native relational database capabilities, right? And then as well as adding security implications like security roles, role-based controls, and so on. So that's the first. That covers the first scenario, right? Where we had existing SharePoint list app and we wanted to migrate that to Dataverse. So that's what we saw. We had this employee list app and we moved that into Dataverse apps. So now let's take a look at the other scenarios where we have employee intranet in SharePoint, and we want to understand, how can we utilize existing SharePoint sites and some of the capabilities that we have within SharePoint into Power Apps. So to demonstrate that, I would like to introduce you all to Power Pages. And Power Pages, so Power Pages is Microsoft's way of creating secure websites. You can call it portal, right? Or it can be some employee intranet and so on. Power Pages allows you to do that with no code, right? So let me open Power Pages first. And the reason Power Pages is really attractive is because of its licensing model, right? So you don't have to license everyone individually. There is different ways you can license, right, based on the number of logins, or you can buy a bucket of licensing for internal users as well as external users, right? So it's really scalable in that sense. So I'll show you a very simple example where we're gonna be able to utilize some of this document management capabilities that we have within SharePoint into Power Pages, right? So this is my Power Pages environment. So I'll just click edit here. I already have one existing Power Pages. And what we're gonna do here is we want to embed some of our document capabilities from SharePoint into Power Pages, okay? So to demonstrate that, let me go back here in SharePoint and just choose any sites that I want to show there. So let me see. I'm just going to go one more step back. So, okay, so we have this approval site, right? And we want some of these document management capabilities to be available to our end users. And, the idea here is we want to make it much more collaborative, and we also want to utilize a lot of capabilities, right, that Power Platform provides on top of that. So in that kind of scenario, Power Pages makes it so much easier for you to bring that existing SharePoint document management solution you have into Power Pages. So one of the ways that I typically demonstrate customer is using iframe within Power Pages, right? So what it does is, it allows you to bring that SharePoint UI and as well as the SharePoint actions here into Power Pages. Okay, so to demonstrate that, I'm going to create a new page. I'm going to call this, let's call it this SharePoint document collab, right? Collab page. Power Pages gives you all these different templates so that you can have a quick jump start to creating pages. And over here, I can just add, okay, document collab for now. And we want to embed that SharePoint here, right? So I'll create a new place here and I'll use the iframe service here and we will just add the URL here. So just doing that much, we are able to bring that document management capability within Power Apps, right? So now, the other cool thing about this is that, the permission, the site level permissions that you have within SharePoint is respected by this particular integration that we did here, right, within Power Pages. And furthermore, you have the capability of adding more security now because Power Pages provides you with that Dataverse capability where you can have much more role-based controls, right, and as well as limit how and which page you want the end user to see, right? So one of the ways that we can do this is through permissions within Power Pages. So so this is one of the example. Let me just preview, right, and show you the end result here. So no thanks. So it takes some time to render, but you'll see that we're able to bring that existing document collaboration capability of SharePoint within Power Pages, right? So now as an end user, I can go and go to the folder and see all the documents that I have access to. Now, there's different ways for you to integrate SharePoint within Power Pages, right? But this is just one of the example, right, to demonstrate to get more value out of the SharePoint document collaboration you already have, and you want to expand it, right, and scale it, right? Whether you want to share the documents externally or internally, or whether you want to expand and create this entire employee experience within Power Pages, you're able to utilize this particular technique that I showed you here. Okay. So let me show you. So we're able to see two different scenarios for transition journey. And the third one is, the one I have highlighted in green here is something that we already saw in the technical demo I showed you, right, where we had two different data sources. So you will be able to just change the data source within Canvas app. And once you have that data already available in Dataverse, you can just point to the data source as Dataverse and have that migration done easily. Okay. So this was more focused on data migration. Now, um, you know, if you have any further questions, please ask us in the Teams channel. We'll handle that. And now, because of the time constraint, I'd like to go towards wrapping up and also share you what are some of the learning sources that we have for you all. Okay, so we're able to see and understand, pros and cons of choosing the Dataverse versus SharePoint. We're able to go through the journeys and see different scenarios, how we are going to migrate existing SharePoint apps into Dataverse. Now let's take a look at some of the resources that we have. Okay, so I'll be sharing you this after this webinar, but I suggest you all to start learning Dataverse, and there is a link that we can share you. And there are several webinar and conference links that you can go and attend as well, which gives you much more insights into how different businesses and different companies use Dataverse, right? Typically, we see customers using Dataverse for a lot of fusion development, meaning that they have pro code team, programmers, and as well as they have business users and citizen developers who are creating apps together, right? So really important to go and check all these different links here. So we'll share you this right after this meeting. But again, thank you so much all for your time. I hope you are able to understand our perspective on using Dataverse versus SharePoint, and as well as some of the advantages and value that either of this data source can provide you to your business. So thank you very much. Thank you.